So I didn't get enough of early Rome in my last video when I covered Emperor Nero. Therefore, today we are going to dive into the intriguing world of sex in ancient Rome. You can see where my mind went after talking about Nero. He's always depicted as this sexual deviant, and oftentimes whenever I hear things about the ancient Romans, sex is always there, whether it's at the forefront or the background. And then also, a lot of depraved things. Not saying orgies are depraved, but less vanilla stuff. So anyway, I thought, why not? So clutch your togas and strap in or on.
You're a dummy, bitch.
As we traverse the sex lives of the ancient Romans. Before I dive in, I also want to mention that much of the ancient Romans' lives are tied into the lives of the ancient Greeks, and quite often that line is very blurred. There's a long history between the two that I'm not going to dig deep into, so some of the information I discuss in this video crosses over into Greek culture. In the modern Western world and parts outside of the Western world, most people define sexuality based on the concept of gender, specifically the gender identities of ourselves as well as the people that we have sex with or that we're attracted to. And modern society has broken sexuality into a spectrum of sexualities, like homosexuality, heterosexuality, pansexuality, asexuality, bisexual sexuality, and many, many more. But the ancient Romans, their approach to sexuality was super different. Sexuality for them was deeply rooted in masculinity. For men, it didn't matter if they were heterosexual or homosexual or anything in between. However, it was important for men to be masculine. That was my masculine voice. To quote Craig Williams' 2010 book, Roman Homosexuality, this is the world of heroic bravado with a very Mediterranean flavor where the important thing is to be the ravisher, never mind the sex of the victim.
Double cheeked up on a Thursday afternoon.
So in summary, what mattered was who was doing what action in the bedroom. You were either an active partner known as ver, or you were a passive partner known as sinitis or canitis. Honestly, I'm not sure on the pronunciation. So for example, if two men were engaged in sex that had some element of penetration, the one doing the giving was the ver, or the active partner. And with oral interactions, the partner who was receiving was also the ver. So in summary, the way that you operated in the bedroom was a measure of one's own masculinity, not the gender of you in relation to who you slept with. Now, when it comes to women in ancient Rome, not nearly enough has been recorded about their lives, especially compared to men, and especially when it comes to their sex lives. If you watched my video on Nero, then you already know that the histories that we have to depend on were created by male historians and politicians, with a very, very limited view on those around them and the world. But the ancient Romans, they were not shy about depicting sexual acts. You can find a lot of male genitals and a variety of sexual acts on vases, plates, frescoes, gems, and even jewelry. And these images depict a variety of sexual acts, including threesomes, foursomes, fellatio, cunnilingus, and again, just a lot of penis. There's a lot. So I have to share this. Check out this mural that was found in Pompeii, and it dates back to 89 BC to 79 AD. And yes, the length of that blur is necessary. I'm telling you, just Google Pompeii sex murals or whatever. It's a treasure trove, if you want to look at it that way, of just sex art. I came across this figure created by the Greeks in 490 BC, where this person is carrying a literal bag of poo. And what makes it even better is that the poo have eyes. Why in the world do we need all-seeing poo? Obviously, throughout this video, I'm going to try to make as much of this stuff as PG as I can, at least somewhat. I'll be blurring out quite a bit, but I want to try to leave something there to give some context to what I'm talking about. So the ancient Romans took a very unique approach when it came to cunnilingus. in that they didn't. It was dry. There was none. Due to their machismo approach to masculinity, the act of performing cunnilingus was laughable, and this ties into the whole idea of being the active partner to prove one's manliness. When a woman is depicted receiving oral pleasure in Roman art, it is typically a reciprocal or 69 situation, but it is believed to be some exceptions to this. There's evidence that women could hire male sex workers to fulfill this sexual need, and actually in Pompeii, some graffiti was found that advertised cunnilingus prices for male sex work. But because the notion of doing this act as a man in ancient Rome was just so vitriol and also just absurd, the graffiti could have been an insult to the men that were listed as performing said services. An even more offensive insult to a man would be being accused of performing fellatio on another man. God, with all the threesomes, at least that I've heard about, that took place in ancient Rome, I'm sure you've heard about the orgies and all that if you've ever come across anything related to the ancient Romans when it comes to sex. How is this even possible? With all these rules, customs, stipulations, ego, how are you able to have sex with so many people at the same time? That sounds like a headache. At that point, I don't even know why you would bother, or even if it was possible. You can't perform, you can't, it's too much, it's too much. Just like in bedrooms today, the ancient Romans and Greeks were not afraid to introduce sexual aids into the mix, and evidence suggests that the ancient Greeks and possibly Romans used olive oil as a lubricant for both anal and vaginal intercourse. Also, in the vein of sexual aids, archaeologists believe that they found a 2,000-year-old ancient Roman dildo. The dildo was found in 1992 in a ditch along with shoes, dress accessories, and craft waste at the Roman fort of Vindolanda in Northumberland. Now, other uses for this 2,000-year-old artifact have been theorized, like being a penis-shaped pestle, or a statue that people would touch for good luck. And apparently when it was first discovered, it was cataloged as a darning tool. And if you're like me and you don't know what the hell a darning tool is, fear not, for I shall tell you, because I had to look that shit up. It's a tool used to help mend cloth materials like socks, and it helps to provide a stable surface for non-flat areas. When I was a kid, I was taught by my mother to use a light bulb, and I would just throw that thing in the sock and I would stitch on the outside of the bulb, and voila. You mean to tell me this whole time people were going out and buying a specific tool for this task? Now, for shits and giggles, let's compare the two. Here's a darning tool, okay? There it is in all its glory. And here is the 2,000-year-old artifact. I'd bet everything in my bank account that that is a dildo, and I don't have much in my account. If you're curious to know about the specs of this artifact, let me share that with you. The dildo is 16 centimeters long, or a little over 6 inches, and researchers say that it was more than likely bigger than it is now because wood typically shrinks over time. Pause. What's really interesting is that wood that old would have typically decayed or burned by now. And it's also not out of the realm of possibility that this phallus could have been used for not pleasure, but for pain or torture as well. This is another theory. I personally would be afraid to even use this thing for pleasure, okay? When I see this, all I can think about is getting a splinter.
Hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
I know. I know. It's gross, right? But that's what I'm thinking about. It looks like it would need a lot of olive oil, especially when you're thinking about this thing is hot off the press. It was just carved. No, thank you. Even though sex work was seen as a necessary profession and often sought out in ancient Rome, it was seen as a shameful profession as well. And this is due to a double standard that existed in this culture. At the same time, men were not shamed for purchasing said services, as long as it was within moderation. What that moderation is, what's considered a moderate amount of receiving or paying for sex work, I have no idea. Sex workers were part of a marginalized group in ancient Rome whose profession consisted of selling their bodies as a service. Some of these other professions included actors as well as gladiators. That was surprising to me. I had no idea. I knew that on the social ladder that they weren't, but at least actor, I was shocked. Gladiator, not so much, but actor, I was really surprised. My modern brain likens this to Viola Davis or Leonardo DiCaprio receiving the same public reception as Sukihana or Bella Delphine. Not saying there's anything wrong with any of those people that I just mentioned. I'm thinking about social public reception. Now, the ancient Romans were able to identify sex workers based on their attire. In ancient Rome, both men and women wore a specific type of toga, and per etiquette and social customs, only sex workers and adulteresses were permitted to wear male togas. And that's more like they had to make it easy for the public to identify them based on their social status. And if you weren't a sex worker or if you weren't an adulteress, if you were caught wearing this toga, it was seen as disrespectful. Now, the rationale behind this, it's something. The rationale was that women who were sex workers were believed to have sexual appetites on par with men. And it was believed that the desire of men was just off the charts. It was gone, could not be tamed. And women who were not sex workers were expected to retain sex acts within the marriage bed to maintain their honor as well as integrity. Now, to find clients, sex workers would sometimes work in taverns as waitresses and as innkeepers. They could also walk the streets looking for their next John or post outside of brothels. And some sex workers operated independently, and some had pimps who controlled their entire lives. They were told by their pimps what they could wear, what client they could see, how much they were paid. Unfortunately, much like in sex work today, there was a hierarchy system for sex workers in ancient Rome. The more expensive sex worker was called meretrix, and sex workers who charged less were called scorum, which means leather skin. Honestly, just the sound of that name, just scorum. You're a scorum. I don't like that. It just sounds gross. It sounds rough, right? Like I'm getting the vibe. I'm getting from that what they're giving off, okay? That's a horrible sounding name. And they were also sometimes called lupa, which means she-wolf. Now let's meander for a little bit over to male sex workers. Male sex workers could engage in the profession with male clients without fear of legal punishment. However, due to the limitations imposed by the social class system, Roman citizens were discouraged from providing sexual services to enslaved people, non-citizens, or other groups of lower social standing. And these restrictions made it very difficult for Roman citizens to pursue sex work. Therefore, most male sex workers were enslaved and or non-citizens. And this was also the case for female sex workers. By the 4th century BCE, the number of enslaved people and non-citizens were restricted, leading to a demand for male sex workers and an increase in price. The Roman statesman and orator Cato states that the cost for sex work was higher than farmland. And as I've already mentioned, a lot of what we know about the ancient Roman world comes from men who were politicians and historians, which is a terrible combination. So you got to kind of take what you will from their histories, because what they share might not necessarily reflect what the entire populace felt about sex workers and other people within their social system. We're talking about just a handful of the same men sharing this stuff and telling these stories, so. In the ancient Roman world, the onus was usually put on women to prevent pregnancy. Approaches to contraceptives could include a combination of folk medicine, magic, and treatments provided by physicians. Some ingested medical wines made by midwives or physicians, and plants like pennyroyal and acacia were used. Other methods included various items that offered barrier protection, like sponges soaked in vinegar, oil, and cedar resin. There were also protective spells and amulets. Because ancient Rome was a hyper-masculine society, there are many debates about the ancient Romans in relation to homosexuality. It's been equally argued by scholars whether same-sex relationships weren't an issue or if they were condemned. But it appears that in certain contexts, men, and I mean that when I say men, could imply their experiences with the same sex without issue. without fear of ridicule. And what I mean by this is that the status of the partner is what mattered, other than being the ver or, the passive or active. In addition to masculinity, social status meant everything. A freeborn Roman man, whether or not married, could have sexual relations with a sex worker, an enslaved person, or a non-citizen of any gender, as long as he played the penetrating role. But he could not engage with a fellow free Roman. Now, what's crazy when you think about that in relation to what I'm about to tell you is that Roman men could have sexual relationships with boys as young as 12. And in fact, it was expected that older Roman men would take on sexual partners who were young, between the ages of 12 and 20, with the exception, of course, of free Roman boys.
What the hell?
Now, when it comes to same-sex relationships among women, not much is known because not much was documented. These ancient historians were not interested in the sex lives of women, so there wasn't much that I was able to find. However, I did find a little bit of information when it came to their opinions on same-sex couplings amongst women. Lesbianism was referred in less favorable terms compared to male same-sex coupling. And because of the whole active partner approach they had on sex among women was a bit of a conundrum. And so male writers imagined that one woman would have to use a phallic instrument or have a large clitoris in order to penetrate. Clearly, it was the only way. Now, if we briefly look into the lives of intersex ancient Romans, they were oftentimes treated as curiosities or oddities, very similarly to the horrific freak shows that plagued the Western world during the late 19th century to the early 20th century. And they were seen as a delight to the wealthy. A wealthy Roman could purchase an intersex person from what ancient Greek philosopher Plutarch called the monster market. And this was a slave market. Plutarch writes, "Therefore, just at Rome, there are some who take no account of paintings or statues, or even by heaven of the beauty of the boys and women for sale, but haunt the monster market, examining those who have no calves, or are weasel-armed, or have 3 eyes, or ostrich heads, and searching to learn whether there has been born some commingled shape and misformed prodigy. Yet if one continually conduct them to such sights, they will soon experience satiety and nausea." And per Roman law, intersex Romans had to be registered as either male or female. Laws played a pivotal role for the ancient Romans, especially when it came to sex, and specifically male and female sex workers. Yes, we are going back to the sex workers because they do not get enough shine, and their lives were really interesting in the ancient Roman world. Sex workers, actors, gladiators, and other public performers were given the legal status infamia. The legal status meant that they had no legal protections as the rest of the Roman citizens did. This legal status prevented them from participating in many rights, like standing for election to magistrate or speaking in a court of law. So people who participated in these professions had little to no social status as well. So say, for example, if a female sex worker were to be walking down the streets in ancient Rome, wearing clothing that is indicative of her profession, and if some stranger just happened by and assaulted her or him, there's nothing that could be done about it. As far as consequences go, there's none. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for these people, knowing that your life meant nothing, at least to your government. Similarly to an enslaved person, and most of them were, they weren't considered to be a person, but an object with market value. In fact, many women who took on this profession were originally from places like Syria or Egypt and were enslaved by the Romans. And sometimes women were forced into the profession by family members due to poverty, which is not an unheard story in a lot of cultures all over the world, and it still happens today. And just looking specifically at women for a minute, not just female sex workers, there were already a lot of really shitty laws when it came to women. It didn't matter if you were a sex worker, if you were enslaved, if you were a non-Roman or Roman citizen. There were shitty laws when it came to women as a whole, and some of those laws actually had, overlap. This label, infamia, was forced on this group until until the day they died. You carried that shit for the rest of your life. And this infamia classification was so embedded in ancient Roman culture that if a sex worker were to marry a man who wasn't already an infamia, he would now carry this label. So they really tried to prevent these people from being able to, climb the social ladder. They really wanted to keep them where they were. Emperor Augustus would bring in legislation preventing women who were sex workers from marrying freeborn men. It appears that legislation was also introduced to prevent the noble class from participating in the occupation. And people who participated in sex work could not marry someone who fell beyond ex-enslaved status. I swear, at every turn, they were trying to screw over sex workers. When Caligula came into power in 37 CE, he introduced a statute that forced sex workers to register for tax and identification purposes, and this tax was 17 up to 75%. This made it difficult for part-time sex workers to pursue the profession because the amount they had to pay didn't change based on how much they worked. Oh, and this tax also applied to pimps. There was also a such thing as moral zoning, and this could be seen in Pompeii, where you have establishments like brothels and they make sure that they're put way in the back. When people come in, they don't see them immediately. You got to go way, way down. That was what they were doing. Well, that's all I got. There was a ton of stuff that I didn't cover because this video would be crazy long. So maybe I'll do a part 2 at some point. I didn't talk about masturbation. I didn't talk about consent, androgyny, marital sex. There's so many topics that I could cover when it comes to sex with these guys. So maybe a part 2 in the near future. Who knows? Anyway, stay safe out there. I'll see you in the next one.